Okay, we're settled to start. A very warm welcome to the Swedish Institute of International Affairs this morning and today's seminar on the European Union as a global actor. We are very pleased to once again collaborate with a great partner, the European Council on Foreign Relations, ESFR, who every year does a fantastic job with its scorecard assessing the EU on a range of foreign policy issues, and we will soon learn more on the 2014 results of that study. My name is Anna Wislander and I'm Deputy Director here at the Institute, and it's my pleasure to moderate this seminar. If you want to join us on Twitter, please do during the event and use the hashtag UIEvent, and you can also use the hashtag Scorecard2015. 2014 was a year of gloomy world developments, including a new war in Europe, brutal gains of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, fighting in Gaza, outbreak of Ebola virus and epidemic, and migration flows unprecedented in the post-World War II era, about 50 million people. And these challenges remain for 2015, as the world order and the European security structure are trembling. Today, in Minsk, France and Germany are meeting with Russia and Ukraine for what appears as the last straw to settle a peace agreement. Voices for arming Ukraine have become stronger, especially in the US, and tomorrow the leaders of the European Union will meet to discuss further action. For decades, the EU has been struggling with how to speak with one strong voice on foreign and security policy, at the same time as the right to veto remains. How to match its economic power with political influence on a global scale. In light of current developments, there is even greater demand for the EU for united action and also for strategic thinking as a global actor. The ECFR scorecard measures both the performance of the EU on the global stage and the level of activity of each member state, including Sweden. So how did the EU respond to the challenges in 2014? And what role did Sweden and other countries play in EU's common foreign policy? This will be the focus of today's discussion, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the speakers of the panel. First and foremost, Mark Leonard, who is co-founder and director of the European Council on Foreign Relations, the first pan-European think tank. And Michaela Kumlin-Granit, head of the EU department at the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then Anke Schmidt-Felzmann, who is research fellow at UAE's Europe Research Program, and Roderick Parks, who also is research fellow with us here at the Europe Research Program. So a very warm welcome to all of you. And we will start with Mark making the presentation of this year's results. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Anna. It's a huge pleasure to be back here in this wonderful institution on such an important day for Swedish foreign policy. And thank you to all of you for coming here to talk about Europe's foreign policy performance rather than going to the Parliament for the more official discussions about where Sweden stands in the world. So yeah, maybe before I start the presentation, I want to begin with a joke I heard last year, which made me once again aware of why we need think tanks like ECFR and why this sort of exercise is important. It's a joke about the end of the world. God decides to summon the Chinese, American and British leaders to tell them that the world is going to end the next day and ask them to prepare their people for this result. And Barack Obama goes first. He calls a press conference in the Oval Office and says, my fellow Americans, I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is that God exists, but unfortunately the world is going to end tomorrow. And then Xi Jinping does his press conference on CCTV. He says, got some bad news and some worse news. Unfortunately, God does exist and the world is going to end tomorrow. And then David Cameron comes bounding down the streets of number 10 to talk on the BBC and has a big smile on his face. He's like, I've got some great news. God thinks I'm one of the 3 most important people in the world. And I think as the world becomes more and more dangerous and complicated, there is a growing sense in different places that events outside our borders are outside of our control, and there's more and more of a tendency for politics to become introverted and for people to focus on their own identity rather than to think that they can actually shape what is going on around them. And one of the ideas behind this scorecard is actually to try and look from the bottom up at what's actually going on in different parts of the world and to try and understand what sort of impact we can make as Europeans and how we can actually try and shape the future prospects of our own citizens, as well as engaging with others in the pursuit of a better world. And that's really the basic principle behind the foreign policy scorecard, which is, which is an attempt to think sort of quite comprehensively about all of the different aspects of European relations over the course of the year, but to break it down into key policy issues. And I think this year we looked at 66 different policy areas. And in each of those areas, we try and assess how well Europeans collectively have done in meeting their goals. And we define Europe in the same way that it looks to other people, the mix of national governments, European institutions, and others, rather than just looking at the institutions in Brussels. And we try to think in each of those areas about 3 sets of issues. One, how united are we? Secondly, how much are we investing in the policies that we've developed? Are we putting really serious resources behind them? And resources can be political commitment as well as military, economic, or other sorts of resources. And thirdly, how much of a difference are we actually making? Are we affecting the outcomes? And when we look at the outcomes, we try and think about, you know, given the real world that we live in, how much impact was it realistic to expect the EU to make on those issues? And the way that we do this is we have a team of about 40 researchers who look both at the different parts of the world. So there's 6 main chapters which look at different groups of issues. And then we also have researchers in the 28 member states of the European Union who assess what their national governments are doing and how they contribute to these outcomes. And that whole enterprise is overseen by a steering group which has got several hundred years of experience at the top of international diplomacy, and it's a completely pan-European group which is chaired this year by the former Latvian President Vika Freiberger and Robert Cooper, who until recently was a senior official in the External Action Service. So that's the kind of core framework. And then the final thing, which is the most fun element, is we try and assess what contributions the different member states make and identify the supporters of European policy, but more dramatically, who the leaders and slackers were on a number of these different components. So that's what the scorecard is. The topic of 2014 was crisis. 2014 was a year where Europeans confronted the end of the post-Cold War order in our continent. If the Yugoslav wars ended the Cold War European order, 2014 and the annexation of Crimea brought an end to the post-Cold War order. And I think it was a year where we saw Russia, after it annexed Crimea and invaded eastern Ukraine, transform itself from being Europe's problematic strategic partner into a serious strategic problem for the whole of the European Union. And it was also a year where, if you look south at the southern neighbourhood, we saw an increasingly fraught situation in the Middle East and North Africa, with the rise of Islamic State, a continuation of the brutal civil war in Syria, a return of conflict to Libya, and a brutal crackdown in Egypt, all of which created a major refugee and migration crisis on Europe's southern borders. And if you put all of those things together, I think it was also a year where we realized that a lot of the concepts and the ideas that had defined European foreign policy over the last decade or so were exposed as being relatively shallow and weak, whether it was the idea of strategic partnership with Russia, the idea of a European neighbourhood policy, or even comprehensive approach, ideas like more for more, were all exposed as being sort of shallow compromise phrases, which had increasingly, well, a decreasing bearing on reality. So how did Europe fare when confronting these kind of major crises? Well, the reality and the surprise, I think, was how well Europe rose to the major challenge that it faced, which was the challenge from Russia. It took a long time to realize what was going on. The first few months after the annexation were characterized by a reactive policy. I think some member states thought that with a bit more diplomatic engagement and dialogue, it would be possible to return to the status quo ante. But it was surprising that by the summer of 2014, the EU had achieved a degree of unity and joint purpose on Russia that would have been unimaginable a few years earlier. When ECFR launched in 2007, our very first report was called A Power Audit of EU-Russia Relations. And at that time, the first sentence of that report was, Russia has divided the EU more completely than anyone since Donald Rumsfeld split us into old and new Europe. And the combination of geography, history, and divergent economic interests meant that in 2007 there wasn't one EU policy towards Russia. There were 5 competing policy paradigms which were undermining and cancelling each other out. And there was very little sense of solidarity between European states. Whereas what we've seen I think in the 3 packages of sanctions which Europeans have adopted is quite a surprising degree of unity and a willingness by member states to actually take on sacrifices to their economic well-being and their economic prospects in order to deal with a real strategic threat to the continent. This unity was obviously enhanced by the downing of MH17, which allowed the EU to come together in a way that it hadn't been able to do before that. And it is also something which I think is going to be increasingly challenged as we go into the future, because one of the problems with the sanctions regime is that though we, I think, had no choice but to do it, because being seen to be weak would have been an invitation to further aggression. The more successful sanctions are, the more likely they are to lead to aggressive behavior from Vladimir Putin. So, and I don't think there is a shared understanding about what comes after the sanctions or what kind of European order might emerge now that the post-Cold War order is finished. But on that big central challenge, we think that the EU did much better than anyone could have envisaged beforehand. However, one of the consequences of that joint focus on Russia is that when it comes to the other crises that I was describing, the EU scored very badly and was but divided, not really managing to shape events properly, had much less impact than a lot of other regional actors, and didn't really have a plan to deal with many of those crises.
And that applies both to the security crises in the southern neighbourhood, but also disappointing lack of unity when it came to the immigration crisis as well. So that feeds into the next slide, which looks at the areas where Europe did best, which you can see sanctions and trade with Russia is right at the top of the table. Also, good cooperation on Iran, but a lot of the areas where Europe did best were to do with the Russian and Ukrainian crises. And then if you look at where Europe did worst, they are often things in the southern neighbourhood: regional security in the Middle East, immigration in the Mediterranean, Syria and Iraq, and then a sort of lack of attention to Sudan's, DRC, Central African Republic, Libya. So that's the kind of overall picture. But if you look in the report, you can go obviously through all 66 components and find out a more granular assessment of how the EU did in different areas. So that brings me to the question of how this came about and who drove European foreign policy. And that's, I think, also a very interesting story for 2014, one which could also have long-term implications. And normally, when we look at the leaders and slackers in our foreign policy scorecard, there's a sort of bunching together at the top of the league table between the three biggest member states who jostle for the #1 place: Britain, France, and Germany. But 2014 came up with a very different result. Firstly, and most obviously, Germany has shot out of the cluster at the top and is on its own as the indispensable power on European foreign policy, and has found a degree of leadership which eluded Germany in the early years of the Euro crisis, and has managed both to establish itself as a political leader, but also as a broker and a mediator between different interests within the European Union. And what is very interesting about the German leadership, because we saw Germany emerging as a foreign policy leader quite early on during the Euro crisis, but if you look at the scorecard this year, you can see that Germany is leading, unlike any other member state, across all regions in all different areas. And the type of leadership that it's displayed was also quite a wide range of different things, as a trailblazer, as a broker, as a builder of consensus. The second interesting finding for this audience is the #2 slots. Sweden has emerged as joint #2 with the UK. And again, I think the Swedish leadership style is also quite an important part of that. Our researchers talk about brokerage, sponsoring things, setting examples. And like the UK, it has ranked as a leader on 11 issues. For Sweden, these include quite a wide range of issues. Obviously, a lot to do with Russia and the Eastern crisis, but also things like EU coordination on China, climate change, supporting democratic reform in wider Europe. It is a slacker once for not supporting a European policy on privacy and intelligence, but by and large, it is quite a surprising finding that that Sweden, which isn't one of the biggest countries, at a time where there are major geopolitical threats to the EU, which I think at last year's scorecard launch, people were predicting that this would be a time for the big member states rather than smaller member states, that Sweden's emerged in such a prominent position. The other joint second, I think, is equally surprising, because if you look at the British newspapers, you'd be forgiven for thinking Britain's not even in the European Union at all, let alone playing a leading part in shaping European foreign policy. But this shows that in spite of the toxic debate about British EU membership at home, Britain has actually played quite a constructive part on a whole series of different issues, such as TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, developing Russia sanctions, countering the advance of Islamic State. The fourth place country is also quite surprising. Last year, I think France was at the top of the leaderboard. This year, they've fallen down, obviously behind Sweden, but quite a long way behind Sweden. And one of the reasons for that is to do with the nature of French leadership, because its leadership is often a sort of trailblazer leadership where it sets a course, whether it's on intervening in the Central African Republic or dealing with ISIS. And France still has the desire to lead, but where it often falls short is its ability to bring followers with it. And I think that is one of the things that is reflected in this year's rankings. Also on the top of the leaderboard, you can see a lot of Central and Eastern European countries, Poland, the Baltic states, which I suppose all had leadership thrust upon them by the events that have unfolded in our continent. I'll end by looking at the other side of the table, the slackers. Who knew that little Malta would be the most destructive member state when it came to European foreign policy? What's even more interesting than the countries on there is actually the big discrepancy between the number of issues which people are leading on, 17 for Germany, and the very modest number of issues where you have slackers. So the top slacker was Malta with just 3. And I think it showed that when the crisis struck, Europe has come together and has actually behaved in a more united way than it did beforehand. And that, I suppose, explains why the rankings in this year's scorecard are more generous than they were in previous years. And I think it also shows that there is some hope for European foreign policy and for people to have an impact on the world. I started with God, so I'm going to end with the Pope, who talked about Europe becoming like an old grandmother, weary, aging, no longer fertile. I think this year's scorecard showed that papal infallibility is maybe somewhat overrated, and that there might still be life in the old girl. And I hope that out of the sort of major crisis of European security that we've had, in spite of a lot of the latent dangers which I described earlier in our kind of moment of unity that we had this year, there might be a really serious geopolitical awakening that comes out of this, and an attempt to think more seriously about the future security of the European continent and what kind of European order we want, but also a greater ambition to take responsibility for our own security, and also a recognition of what it is that makes the European Union special, and what makes our model of security, which was so hard won over the last few decades, worth defending and defining as we move into the next year. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Mark. We will soon move on. I just wanted to catch up on the last thing you said a bit, because it's obvious that the EU has a strategic deficit, you can say, even though it's now have met up to quite a lot of challenges during 2014. But can you say something on the balance between proactive and reactive still? Is it still a majority of these issues that you follow that in the EU is reactive?
Yeah, I mean, I think foreign policy, you know, as a former British Prime Minister said, is largely driven by events. So the fact that we've been reactive is not necessarily disastrous, but I think in order to react to events, it helps to have a sense of where you want to go, what your principles are, and that is my big worry about the Russia situation, because I think what happened in 2014 is something really to be proud of, which was not a given at the beginning of the year, that Europe would be able to unite behind these packages of sanctions, to stick to them, to show real solidarity to each other, and to hold together in the face of Russian aggression. But my big worry is that we have no idea about where we're going to. Sanctions are an instrument, they're not a strategy. We can't go back to the old post-Cold War order. Russia doesn't want to be part of it. There are other countries like Turkey that don't want to be bound in by the old institutions. So we're not going to have a unipolar Europe where security is guaranteed simply by NATO and by the European European Union and everybody finding their way within that system. But at the same time, we can't accept Putin's idea of the European order, where you have spheres of influence where countries are not really sovereign over their own affairs. So the question is, where is it that we want to go? How do we find a way of living together amongst ourselves within the European Union, with other powers like Russia and Turkey that are outside the European Union but have geopolitical ambitions, and that in a way that gives sovereignty and choice to countries that are between these different projects. And that is something which I don't think there is a shared sense amongst Europeans on. And that's my biggest worry, is that if we don't have a debate amongst ourselves about what kind of order we want to create, we're not going to be able to use the political capital that we get out of sanctions or other policies to move forward to some sort of political solution. Because it's ultimately... it's become. I was in the Munich Security Conference last weekend, and the most overused phrase was, "There is no military solution to what's happening in Ukraine." I mean, I'm not sure Vladimir Putin agrees with that, but I think that they are right. There is going to have to be some sort of political settlement on the European continent, and I don't think that we're able to talk about it or to think about it. Instead, what we do is we repeat our support for things that happened in the past, which are increasingly disconnected from reality. So in the old days, it was about the other treaties that we'd signed. You know, we talk about Helsinki, we talk about Minsk as the new Helsinki. I think so. We say, as it becomes increasingly clear that Minsk is dead and that it's never going to be adhered to, we repeat even more loudly our commitment to Minsk. Poroshenko was in Munich as well. He was saying, we can't freeze this conflict, it has to be resolved. Be wonderful if we could freeze this conflict. I mean, I think that is anyway. That's a short, a long answer to your question. Is I don't think that we necessarily have a clear enough sense of where we want to go to and of how we see European security going. But I think there is a chance that we might start that debate this year, because Federica Mogherini has promised to have, with some pressure from the Swedish government in the past, to think about revising the European security strategy. There's going to be a review of the much discredited European neighbourhood policy as well. And maybe those occasions could be a way for member states to have a serious discussion about where we want to get to.
Thank you very much. Perhaps that's a good line for Michaela to take over and
yes. How do I do this?
Contribute with your...
It's working. It's fine. Thank you.
Fine.
Well, thank you so much for an extremely interesting presentation. I will make a couple of short comments on the leadership, 3 points on leadership connected to this report and the leadership within the EU. But first, I just would like to say that very good report. And as a Swedish diplomat, I love the results. Really. Thank you. Keep up the good work. Maybe we can make #1 next year. Anyway, but what is mostly interesting is that I think that report reflects in a very good way the new situation that we are in these days on the power politics that we have entered into with the neighborhoods in flare, and where national interest is something that is more marking the foreign policy of the EU. And it's a very good starting point when you also start to talk about the leadership issue. And here, of course, the leader, Germany, is the one that has been, of course, the most pertinent one. And it's like you alluded to, 5 years ago, Merkel and Germany, they were by force nearly convinced to take leadership on the Greek issue for the first time in 2010. And during these years now, we've seen a growing leadership from the German side, from Merkel, not only on the European economic side, but also on the internal European issues such as treaty change, such as on the UK issue, freedom of movement, core European issues. And now, of course, on the foreign policy side, where clearly, according to your report, but also in reality, Germany is really the clear leader. The question here, though, is this German leadership or is it Merkel leadership? I mean, Merkel is very specifically, she has managed to get pan-European credibility for her leadership. So it's very much about not only being Germany, but it's about personality, but also a little that you mentioned, the way to lead through coalitions and also to take initiatives and try to make them to joint EU policies and working very hard to keep the EU unity and member states' unity. So I think it's something that one needs to think about when one talks about German leadership. The second thing, the leadership from the EU institutions, they're not mentioned in your report, just vaguely. So at one point it would be interesting to maybe in some time put in the HR or the President of the European Council as one of those players to see if they get any points at all, or if it is so that they are just a secretariat for us member states. We have all alluded to that the leadership, and also mentioned in your report, from these EU institutions on the foreign policy side, the High Representative, the President of the European Council, and the Commission, have been quite weak. Of course, we say this is very much due to the transition in Brussels, the change of guards that we had, and also because of the European economic crisis, which made the leaders and the more bound to look inwards. Unfortunately, I think also, and I hope really that I'm wrong, that we're also seeing the effect and the tendency after 5 years of the Lisbon Treaty, where we might need to state that maybe we didn't manage to do what we wanted to do, namely to marry all the pros. The increased coordination, which we hope with these new personalities, and the continuity aspect of getting out of the rotating presidencies, to connect this with what we now are missing, the national energy or the national interest which member states put into their presidencies, which kind of kept some kind of movement and kind of leadership coming from Brussels through these energy pumps every 6 months. So that's something that I'm a bit worried that this Lisbon Treaty has actually led to that one has lost that. However, this said, I must say that I still am very hopeful. I hope that the new Commission, with its great ambition on the double hatting on the external side, will work out eventually. That Mogherini now, when she's in ship shape, I hope with the procedures and she has the right people around her, will start to take moves, be more strategic in her working methods and so forth, and live up to this that we need. Better coordination with member states and the more strategic outreach in the way she works. And thirdly, of course, we have extreme high hopes for Tusk, who we know is one of those foreign policy wonks that could really manage to drive policy, even though his position is always a bit awkward. Thirdly, last but absolutely not least, Sweden. I must say that, again, I'm very happy about the results, and I was very surprised that Sweden scored so high this year, because last year, we had the time to think about strategic issues, and let's review the EAS, which we were very strong in, and let's think about the strategic framework, the EGS. These were things that we could manage to do then. You could also work on the Western Balkans, not an acute issue. So, of course, a very active, middle-sized country could be quite active, but to score high in today's geopolitical world is quite positively surprising. And for me, I think that this shows something, that it was not a blip last year. It shows that it's a long-term investment to be very efficient in foreign policy, especially in the EU. It's something that you work on for years and years and years. It's not due to one government or another. It's a continuously work where both political sides share the view that the EU is one of the most important platforms that we actually have for our foreign policy. We celebrated or marked the 20th year, 20 years in the EU now in January, and I can just state that it's incredible that we have come so far. Just the fact that we're among the top 5 here is incredible. If you think about 20 years ago when we entered, where the question was, should we be still in the EU or should we leave the EU? Now we have a government with the Green Party who just a couple of years ago, or is it 5 years ago, was prepared to work to leave the EU. This changed 6 years ago, and now we have ministers, Green Minister working extremely hard on the EU issues, not least our Minister for Development Affairs. So the EU issues and the way that we work on the foreign policy side within the EU and with capitals and institutions is something that is, I think, here to stay. Now, will we score as well next year? I don't know. I think staying in second place is quite impossible, whoever you are, whatever country you come from. But anyway, we'll try to do our best there as well. And I think it's a good, it's a continuity thing that also lies with the diplomatic service of Sweden.
Thank you very much, Mikael. I was just, before we move on, I was just curious about that because it's, of course, it's a combination of political efforts and the diplomatic efforts, but the diplomats are there to stay. And what would you say would be the recipe then for Swedish successful diplomatic efforts? What do we do? Coalition buildings, and how do we pursue our influence as a medium-sized country within the EU?
Well, I think that very much, it's also pointed out in your report that we have learned the hard way on how to maneuver the EU. It's a craft, the EU machinery, and working with EU member states, not through coalition building, and also always working in cooperation with others and through the institutions. A little like the Germans, that initiatives you have, you do them through the structures. But it's also about learning. We're very Swedish, so for us to learn how to use the informal networks in multilateral systems is something that we have learned the hard way. We were very bad at this 10 years ago, but we're getting better at it. Another thing is that we've had a very clear policy on wanting to have many Swedes in the institutions, for instance, in the EU institutions. And there you need quite some political initiatives to work for that, and also in the human resources to always have the same message to our young diplomats that try to take a turn in Brussels during your career, because that will help you to understand how foreign policy is actually managed. So I think those are components that I see during the last couple of years.
Thank you very much. So Anke, next speaker, welcome.
Yes, so we have heard that the EU apparently did extremely well with Russia during 2014, since one of the EU's foreign policy successes were the sanctions, according to the scorecard. I wanted to go back a little in time. The score that the EU received in the scorecard on Russia is the same as 2 years ago. So in 2012, the EU did as well as it did in 2014 regarding Russia. On the overall score, of course, we have to have a look at the details. That in itself perhaps is a problem of the way in which the scorecard judges success and failures, outcomes of the unity and resources. What I would urge all of you to do is to consider that the scores on EU unity and EU resources perhaps tell us more about why the EU got the score of B- in 2014 and not a D, or perhaps in the Swedish system an FX. Gör om, gör rätt. So that is something that I think in the bigger picture is not quite reflecting what the European Union was successful with regarding Russia and the Eastern neighborhood in the year 2014. When we are looking at the sanctions and trade, and I wanted to focus on that in particular because it comes up so high on the list of the EU's successes. What it reflects, the success is EU unity, as Mark has explained. EU unity, but not necessarily the outcome. That the sanctions have an economic effect on Russia does not mean that the sanctions' original purpose actually has been achieved. The original purpose of the sanctions was that Russia should leave Crimea, that Russia should not continue to invade and destabilize eastern Ukraine. That has not been achieved, not in 2014 and not so far. So the score on the sanctions is somewhat misleading, but what it does tell us very clearly is that the European Union, the 28 member states, were able to unite around a common policy and to implement it despite the fact that it is costing many member states. That is perhaps a success in itself, but that is an internal success. There is a signaling effect, but it does not mean that the EU's Russia policy has been as successful as the score in the scorecard suggests. We can go through the other scores in a similar fashion. On human rights, perhaps we can question if the EU deserves any points at all for outcome. We also have to ask if we have to consider the scores on the European security guarantees and also on the energy supply in a different fashion. There are issues missing in what the European Union's performance is being scored on. And that is something that you all should have in mind when you read through the ECFR scorecard, because it only tells us one part of the story. Michaela already mentioned that perhaps leadership in the EU is one aspect that has made a difference. That perhaps the EU's unity on sanctions is more due to the fact that Germany was willing to go and support it. Because Germany is the country that has most to lose with regard to the trade relations. We also are missing some part of the picture when we're looking at the energy supply. Because in the energy sector, we actually have another issue that is making a big difference. And that is the EU's internal energy market liberalization. And the fact that the European Commission, together with the European Court of Justice, has managed to force Russian companies to renegotiate certain contracts with companies from the EU in the energy sector, that access of Gazprom to the EU's market is not as easy as it used to be. We have seen that in Lithuania, and that is also something that we can put down for the year 2014. And we also have seen that exactly the EU's internal energy market liberalization, the third package, has had an effect because there is an ongoing case at the World Trade Organization where Russia has submitted a complaint. Also, the success in the trade sector, since we're talking about the WTO, is not really deserving the score that we're getting, because there are ongoing cases against Russia at the WTO, which we don't hear much about in the scorecard. So, to sum up, the internal and the external impact is important to consider when we're looking at that score.
Thank you very much, Anke. I think you really pinpoint a really important dimension there of the combination between the internal cohesion and what's happening and the external unity also, that the force that the EU can act with. And I think Roderick has similar points and challenges to make, continuing perhaps on that theme. So please, Roderick, the floor is yours.
Righto. Thank you. And it's very nice to have Mark here. I think the last time we saw each other was in Poland when I was doing this for Warsaw.
I'm hoping that you're going to be a researcher in every country where we can present the scorecard. After Germany and Poland and now here.
Well, I was going to push back slightly on your comment that leadership had been thrust upon the Poles. I think the Poles think they've been quietly preparing for leadership for a long time. Anyway. I wanted a little bit to pick up on the question of the EU as a global actor. On my stroll back from work yesterday, I was wondering to myself, what are the big sort of questions facing the EU as a global actor at the moment? And I have to say I was a little bit influenced by having listened to Anke present a paper on EU-Russia trade relations. Let me, in a slightly cartoonish way, ask these questions. and then perhaps press Mark a little bit on whether his work on the scorecard gives any answers there. The first question, I think, is does the EU still support globalization? And that may sound like a little bit of a non-question, you know, we can't stop the world and get off. But I think a little bit there's a feeling that globalization has been constituted in a very specific way around, on the one hand, global trade, and on the other hand, representative democracy. And that reflects perhaps a little bit a US preference for global reach and for national sovereignty. And I think increasingly there's a feeling across the world that that perhaps hasn't reached its promise. It's obviously paid huge dividends and lifted people out of poverty, but in terms of its sort of core promises, it perhaps hasn't delivered. So if you're sitting in Russia and you've been promised that sort of virtuous engine of trade liberalization, brings modernization, brings a degree of democratization, brings international recognition, I think there's a feeling of skepticism there. If you're sitting in China, equally you're worried about the rules under which trade takes place and access to market and resources. And I think increasingly in the EU as well, there's a sense that our recipe is traditionally for something different, less for global trade and representative democracy perhaps than for regional liberalization across a broader range and a deeper range of items, and constitutional innovation. So I think a lot of the sort of gridlock and deadlock in the EU is sort of pouring into a feeling of, you know, do we support globalization? So that's sort of the first question, and leads me on to the second. Are we Western or are we European? I think if we're Western, the assumption a little bit, and again I'm being a little bit cartoonish, but I suppose the assumption is that we think the US and its allies won the Cold War, that bipolarity gave way to unipolarity, that 2 minus 1 equals 1, if you like, and that we can restore order by leveraging Western economic weight through TTIP and sort of reimposing order. If we're European, then we take a different view, which is to say, I suppose, that bipolarity gave way to a power vacuum, that 2 minus 1 equals a degree of chaos, and that we have a duty as bipolarity becomes more violent and more brutal to establish regionalism as a sort of building block of the global order between global governance and nationalism. So that's sort of the second question. Do we have a duty to think in Western terms or in regional terms? Are we Western or are we European? And I suppose the third question, and one that we're dealing with at the moment in Minsk, etc., is whether we would be permitted to make that transition, whether other powers would allow the emergence of a different order, which is less westernized, more regional. The US under Obama seems prepared to rely on other powers in theory, but in reality seems forced to oscillate between unilateralism in the sense of troop withdrawal, the killing of bin Laden, etc., or simple non-intervention. Russia might welcome that sort of transition, but it seems that it's unable to play a role other than spoiler. And I think we in the EU also have to ask, have we done anything to make regionalism work as a sort of building block of global order? Not only are we deep in a regional crisis with the Eurozone, but we also seem to have slightly produced two zombie regions to the east and the west, one in the form of the Eurasian Union and the melting of borders in Ukraine, and Russia saying, well, you know, you rewrote the borders of Europe in a essentially non-political and non-democratic way, so we feel legitimized to. And in the south, Islamic State drawing parallels to the EU and free movement, etc., in order to melt borders there. So those, for me, and I say a little bit provocatively and a bit cartoonishly, but those to me seem to be sort of three questions that are not quite dealing with, but are there on the margins. And I wanted to press Mark a little bit on this. I know in a sense that the scorecard is the wrong place to look for these sort of strategic answers. In a sense, you're ticking the boxes. How well are we performing, rather than asking, whether a strategy is there. But a little bit that methodology, I think, works best with things like, the scorecard on the Lisbon strategy, where there really was a strategy there, and you could sort of say, well, is the strategy on social and economic policy just a sort of displacement activity, or are member states living up to their commitments? And as you mentioned, moves are afoot to have a sort of strategic renewal in the EU. So my question, what sort of answers do you draw out of the scorecard for that strategic review process? And how do you then perhaps change the scorecard to reflect the fact that, in a couple of years we may actually have a genuine strategy for EU action? And as Mikael has said, the scorecard is very heavily based on member states rather than EU institutions, etc., etc. The EU seems to have changed. Anyway, so those are my questions.
Thank you very much, Roderick. I think the floor goes back to Mark to respond on the issues, both of some methodological issues on the sanctions, leadership, and questions ahead here from Roderick. Please.
Okay, so start with Anka's points about how we maybe held together very well, but we found it difficult to influence the rest of the world. Yeah, welcome to foreign policy. Foreigners don't always do what you want them to do. It's annoying. But that's their kind of way. So what we try to do in the scorecard is both to look at what it is that we're trying to do, what sort of resources we put into it, how much determination we show in doing it, and then against the background of the imperfect world we live in, where foreigners don't always do what you want them to do, how well did we do? So I don't think you can blame the EU for the fact that its sanctions have not reversed the annexation of Crimea or stopped Putin from doing what he's been doing in East Ukraine. What you can try and do is think about a counterfactual, given that Vladimir Putin, for domestic political reasons and the other things that he was doing, set down a particular policy course, and the EU has the goals that it has. What could the EU have done differently? How well has it managed that policy? How effective has it been? And it's a question of political judgment. What the counterfactual is. When I was doing the presentation and in the introduction, we talk about the fact that what looked like a reasonable result in 2014 might end up being a problem, because I don't know what happens after the sanctions, etc. But obviously, if it had been up to us, Putin would not have annexed Crimea. Yanukovych would have signed the association agreement with the EU. He probably wouldn't have been president of Crimea, etc.
Yeah.
So that's unfortunate that the rest of the world has their own sovereignty and their ways of doing things. But that's what makes foreign policy interesting.
But Mark, if I just because I had a similar puzzle in my head as Anke when I read about the sanctions outcome, and if you look at this year, then when the sanctions are one-year packages will roll out, and the EU will have to assess then has it been successful, and then the Minsk Protocol, of course, will be central in that interpretation of where are we now with regard to Russia. What do you think? How will you assess the 2015 process with regard to EU unity now that the challenge is to, will we prolong the sanctions, or can they be even more tightened, or how do you reason there when you judge the performance?
You have to look at what it is that the European Union wants to avoid, and we have multiple goals. One goal for most European countries is not to go to war with Russia. We could go to war. There are ways that we could have pushed Russia out of Crimea and out of Ukraine.
if the West had collectively decided to put troops in, we could definitely have won a war with Russia. We could have ended the annexation of Crimea. But ultimately, in the kind of grand scheme of things, the preference to not have a war with Russia is more important than the preference for Russia not to annex Crimea. I mean, it's all trade-offs and counterfactuals. But basically, what most EU countries wanted to do was to clearly signal that changing borders by force is not something that we think is legitimate and that we will ever accept. So I suspect the sanctions on Crimea will probably last for the rest of my lifetime, because I suspect Crimea is not going to be returned to Ukraine during my lifetime. And I think it would be wrong for us to remove the particular sanctions which are aimed at Crimea whilst it's being annexed. But in the same way that we never recognise the annexation of the Baltic states, I think it could be decades that particular thing doesn't get resolved. I think our goal is also to try and make sure that Ukraine is a functional state with a government that can make its own choices about what political and other institutions it joins. It's a big challenge. We'll see whether we do. I don't think we're doing enough to support them economically. I think there is a danger that Russia, when Putin looks at his calculus of interest, he's using military tools, but I think he's ultimately hoping that Ukraine will collapse before Russia does, and that will be a way of achieving his goal. I'm not sure if we're doing enough to counter him in that. I mean, it's a whole mix of different things, but I think given the horrible choices that we had to make and the policy tools that we were willing to use, we've done pretty well so far. But I don't think, my problem is that I don't think we have a long-term plan, and that in a way relates a bit to the other questions, which more fundamental questions about strategy that Roderick was asking. Because, I do think the reality for this is that we're in a post-American Europe where the US is an important part of the mix, but ultimately this is not the most important thing for any American president at the moment. The stakes are absurdly low when it comes to introducing sanctions towards Russia. Russia is something which has sort of symbolic value in American politics, so people will line up to bash Russia, but ultimately compared to relations with China or other countries, it doesn't matter very much, which is one of the reasons why it's lucky that Angela Merkel is willing to show some political leadership on it, because this is a problem that we're going to kind of have to solve, where America is going to play symbolic politics with it, can provide some strategic reassurance to NATO countries and do what happened in Cardiff in other areas. But actually, even when it comes to deterrence, a lot of the deterrence is things which the EU itself is going to have to do. It's got as much to do with energy policy as it has to do with NATO and other areas. And that's why I think the long-term future is not a Western kind of unipolar world owned by us. We're going to have to find some sort of political arrangement which allows, I don't think it is a regional integration process. I think it should be several regional integration processes in Europe. So I wrote an essay towards the end of last year with Ivan Krastev, where we talked about the new European disorder, and we argued that actually what we need to do out of this crisis is to recognise that what we built is within the EU is wonderful, but it's incredibly fragile. And our first point should actually be to defend that, to decontaminate that, to deter people from messing around with that. Secondly, we need to think about what kind of institutional order could work in the longer term. And I think that we should actually be establishing relations with the Eurasian Economic Union as a way of rethinking European order, because I think we need also to think about, can there be projects for Russia that we can live with? We can't live with a Russian imperial project where it goes around changing borders by force and stands for a kind of ethnic idea of Russianhood. That's not something that... The very existence of that threatens our idea of what the European order should be. Can we live with a Eurasian Economic Union? Yes, we should be begging the Russians to set up something like the Eurasian Economic Union. It doesn't really exist at the moment. It's not much of a project, but that's exactly the sort of Russian project that we should want, for them to establish trade relations with Armenia, with Kazakhstan, with Belarus, with other countries that don't want to be in the European Union and aren't going to be in the European Union. So we should be encouraging that sort of integration project. and we should be thinking about ways of giving Russia the space to have a kind of integration project of its own, which doesn't threaten what's special about the European Union and doesn't threaten the European choice of countries that don't want to be part of that. So that's the sort of approach which I think we need to start having a debate about amongst Europeans. And I mean, I think your questions are absolutely right. And that also relates to your question about globalization. I think that the single most powerful driver for Russian policy is not about imperial aggression. It is actually fear of globalization. And it's Russian weakness which has been the kind of driving force for Russian policy. It's their reaction to recent history, which is kind of at the back of Putin's mind. The twin shocks of the colour revolutions and the collapse of the Western economic order in 2008 explain why Putin was pushing for the particular policies that he's pushing towards. And I think that's the backdrop in which we need to work, and those are the sorts of things that we should be talking about more as within the EU when we think about our future policy frameworks.
Do you have yes, Anke, should you do that before I would like you to touch on the leadership issues also.
Yes, I'd like just to now say something about a couple of the issues, of course, that are related to Russia and to European security and stability. I think one of the problematic issues that we see, well, both in the way in which the scorecard is designed, of course, and in the way in which the discussions are often conducted in the EU, is to consider that Russia has a right to do things with other countries and that Russia should be the focal point there. I think the Central Asian countries and the countries in the Southern Caucasus, any of the neighboring countries, should freely be able to choose what they want, and they do not necessarily want to integrate in a Eurasian Union. That is a problem, then, if we're addressing the issue of appeasing Russia in some sort of way. We know from current research, and we have a researcher here at the Institute as well, Johan Engvall, who's exactly looking into how are those countries looking at Russia, those countries that should be integrated into a Eurasian Union, if that was really a project that we were willing to support. And they do not necessarily think that that is the way forward for them, for many different reasons, for historical reasons, in the same way in which Russia has historical reasons for wanting to do that. There are also international global trade rules in the World Trade Organization which prohibit that sort of project because they are not necessarily all compatible with the Eurasian Union. But more importantly, a frozen conflict, is that really what we wish for? I don't think so, because allowing Ukraine to turn into yet another frozen conflict. Ukraine has already a frozen conflict on its border with Moldova. So that is not... so my point is, shouldn't each and every state, however small and large, be considered on its own with its own rights and interests, in the same way in which we have to consider the interests of Sweden, of the Baltic states, of Malta even if it is a slacker on certain issues. Maybe it has good reasons to be a slacker on those issues, and maybe looking at it as a slacker is sort of turning it the wrong way around. So that is something both within the EU, each and every state of the 28 member states should be considered on its own, regarding its interests and the reasons for that, and also the third states. So, you know, no spheres of influence.
Okay, short remark on that.
Well, obviously I don't want any frozen conflicts. I'd rather not have any conflicts at all. The question is, in the world that we're in at the moment, what are we willing to do in order to move things forward? Now, I would dearly love to not be where we are, but you know, starting from where we are at the moment, I don't think we should recognise the annexation of other countries' territory. I think we should make sure that people have to pay a price for that. And I just said, for the rest of my life, I think there will be sanctions against Russia for the annexation of Crimea. So I'm not in any way legitimating what's happening. the same time, I do not think it's realistic to see, I mean, you know, if for example, the conflict spreads to Latvia or to Estonia or to NATO members, then I'm sure that there will be, you know, there will be an escalation, and that NATO will get involved in fighting whatever war needs to be fought. But I don't think, A, that we should want to go there. Secondly, I don't think it's realistic that Western troops will be fighting in Ukraine or in other countries. So given that that's the situation, I also don't think it's realistic that Ukraine will win a war against Russia, which is what it's engaged in at the moment. So given all of those things, what's the best possible outcome of this in the kind of short term? So I think, given that, the best thing that could happen would be to have a frozen conflict rather than a hot conflict in some, hopefully in the smallest area that you can possibly have. But, you know, it's a long time since anyone was killed in Transnistria. It's a long time since.
Know that?
Yeah, we do know that. It's literally decades since anyone was killed in a kind of violent conflict there. I mean, there's organised crime and things like that. I wouldn't want to live there myself. But in the real world, I think that what Angela Merkel and François Hollande are doing is unlikely to work. But I'd much rather that they tried to come to a political solution and a political settlement, which can allow, but we have to recognise what it is they're trying to do. They're trying to freeze the conflict, so that Ukraine can get on with rebuilding the state, so that Poroshenko can have a kind of sovereign regime and will have control over most, if not most of the country, but not all of the country. And that's what they're trying to do. If your alternative, if you think that we should be trying to fight the Russians out of there, that's fine, but there'll be consequences for that as well, and you're going to have to work out how you're going to build political support in European capitals to send troops into, or, you know, I don't personally think that arming the Ukrainian army is actually going to result in a military victory and then being able to reclaim the whole of Ukrainian territory, because there will never be able to fight in a symmetrical way against Russia. So I'm not saying that I like any of these things, but these are the difficult decisions that we need to make. And I'm not saying that some countries should be more sovereign than others, but there are strategic reasons, for example, why Armenia is in the Eurasian Economic Union, to do with its conflict with its neighbours and the fact that there aren't that many other military allies that it has on its side if it wants to keep hold of territory, which is, you know, that's the world we're living in. But it's also not up to us to tell the Armenian government or the Kazakh government or other governments whether or not they join the Eurasian Economic Union. They're members of the Eurasian Economic Union. It exists. Our decision is, do we establish diplomatic relations with the Eurasian Economic Union? What kind of relationship do we want to have with them? And we'll let the Armenians and the Kazakhs be sovereign. I think sovereignty has to be a choice not to join the EU institutions as well as to join them. And I think if we respect the Ukrainian and the Moldovan and the Georgian European choice, we should respect the Eurasian choice of other countries. And I don't feel threatened by the existence of a Eurasian Economic Union, particularly one that doesn't have Ukraine in it. I can see why people were worried about...
But you're talking as if there was no middle way, either in the Eurasian Union or in the EU. Of course there's middle ways. I mean, Sweden, Finland are the best examples of the middle way of not being a member of an organization that everyone else thinks they should. You're in the EU.
Okay, what I hear here is, to sum up this somewhat heated discussion, I think what we are touching upon here are actually coming back to strategy. How do we combine fundamental values that should guide us with vital interests of the European Union ahead? And there is obviously good that we are sparking off the discussion here, and there are not any single solutions to that. It's a very complicated puzzle to play. We can continue that discussion. I just want to open up also the floor for questions from the audience, because we have time is moving here. So let's start with, should we start with Mark Renner, who is head of our European research program? So yeah, and then you will have the microphone, and please state your name and if you represent an organization later on. Thank you. So please, Mark, right now. It's not work. Is it working?
Oh, the battery's dead. So I'll just speak my regular.
Here we have another one. Just wait. We'll solve it.
We need the microphone for the video, right?
Yes.
Thank you, Mark Reinhardt from the Institute, and it's great to hear from Mark and from Michele and Anka and Roderick, our researchers here. Just the scorecard in historical perspective, one of the things we've spoken about in previous years, two things, which would be nice to hear you reflect upon in particular, Mark, is the fact that Sweden's normally high score in the scorecard is kind of a function of its development policy, in fact, rather than its EU policy, with the implications therein, that if you want to score high on the scorecard, then raise your development budget rather than raise your defense or diplomatic budgets. But just a reflection on whether that still seems to be the case in the current scorecard. Secondly, in previous years, there's been an indication that those countries which rocket up the league tables, that's the result less of their proactivity and more of a result of abdication from other countries. I think that was something we discussed last year in the case of France. Is that still the case this year? Obviously, Germany is right in the center point of that discussion. And anyway, and just last point, and I wanted to bring up, and you beat me to the point about enlargement, actually. And as on the Ukraine issue, as much as enlargement is off the table, way off the table. I mean, if you look through the inventory of instruments the EU has to deal with the Ukraine problem, I think we have to be honest that the strongest one is enlargement, and it might be worth a strategic discussion within the EU about whether that's possible to put that back on the table. If we're really serious about solving that crisis, politics aside, that's what we have going, and that could really be the thing that fixes it, just to reiterate the point.
Thank you very much. I think we take one other question here, and then we sum up a bit for the panel. Please.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Deirdre Farrell. I'm a former Irish diplomat, but thanks to Mark for the presentation this morning. Just one question. I'd like to hear a little bit more on, you talk about in the report, the slightly counterintuitive result for the UK, given the domestic debate. I mean, one might have thought that you would have seen a pulling back of the UK on leadership on European foreign policy. And just I'd be interested to hear a little bit more of your take on that and how you see that over the coming years as perhaps the EU debate domestically in the UK intensifies. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Please, Mark. And others, if you want.
Yeah, to Mark, it's obviously true that the leaders and slackers depends on the issues that we've chosen, and Sweden does better than many other countries, partly because you are active on a wider set of areas. So, for example, Poland does less well than Sweden, even though on some of the issues that they're on, Poland has got a narrower portfolio of issues. We had the Danish foreign minister talking about the scorecard the day before yesterday, and there was a little funny exchange between him and Carl Bildt, and he was saying, look, you're all over the place. We only have 3 things that we really care about, and luckily we're leaders on all 3 of them: fighting climate change, fighting poverty, and fighting ISIS. Fighting terrorism, and that shows that we're more disciplined. And anyway, I don't want to intrude on private disputes between Swedes and Danes, but but it's definitely a product of our methodology, as well as the activism of Sweden. I think it is the reason Sweden does well is because you are a country which has got ambition in the world and that's willing to put resources into your foreign policy. And there are not that many EU member states, which goes to your question about abdication. It's certainly true that there is more space for countries who want to do things to get stuff done at a time when the EU is a bit more introverted and when there's sort of less ambition to do things. And thank God, I mean, part of the point of our scorecard is to reward that sort of behaviour, because it's difficult enough getting your public in any country to get the public to invest in international relations. So part of what we want to do is to congratulate people who are actually trying to do something and to show some leadership rather than just being introverted. And I think that is a great thing about Sweden, that you still do have that kind of global perspective and ambition to get something done on the world stage, and long may it last. On Ukraine and enlargement, I just don't think it's if you get into the European Union, the European Union is a security community. So I think that you have to solve the security situation before. It's similar to going into NATO. You know, you can't let a country into NATO that has territorial disputes with its neighbours and that is in a real mess. But also, Ukraine is barely functional as a state, let alone as an EU member state. And my worry with the focus on enlargement is that we get so obsessed with building EU member states and aligning the regulations of different countries with EU regulations that we miss the more important thing, which is, you know, does this country actually function? Does it have a judiciary that works? Does it have sovereignty over its own affairs? Does it have a police force and a security system that's not totally infiltrated by its neighbours? Does it have an army that works? Can it pay, etc.? So I think that's the big challenge, is can we stop Ukraine from collapsing as a state and worry about whether it joins the EU? You know, I mean, that's a question for maybe next decade or the decade after that. And it's a distraction, I think, from the real challenge, which is stopping Ukraine from collapsing and resolving the security situation and stopping Russia from basically fighting a war on its territory. I mean, that's the here and now. On the British situation, it's kind of, I think it is somewhat surprising that Britain continues to play a role. There are some examples in the scorecard, particularly where domestic politics ended up meaning that the EU that Britain behaved in a really irresponsible and slacking way on particular, for example, the Mediterranean refugee crisis, where for narrow domestic political reasons, Britain refused to fund some of the border policing. So there are. It's not like the two things are completely isolated from each other, but it does show that, you know, you have an outward-going, quite skillful foreign policy and diplomatic and military community that will just get on with stuff, and domestic politics, you know, Britain should be right at the top of the table. It's one of the biggest member states. It's got a global history. It has a very large and well-funded diplomatic and military service. So it would be shocking if Britain wasn't in the kind of top few performers, given that it devotes much more resources to it and has got the kind of ambition to do things. It has underperformed, I think, compared to its potential, partly because you can make more of an impact if you work with other member states, and Britain is sometimes a bit too instrumental in terms of its relationships with other countries. The current foreign secretary is and the political class is also worried about looking like it's too pro-European, which is why it's underperformed as well. And I think there are particular problems in terms of the British approach to Russia, going back to Litvinenko. So that's something which is successive British governments haven't had much of a policy towards Russia, which sort of explains why there's not much British leadership on stuff apart from sanctions. But in spite of all those things, Britain is a kind of is a force. And if there is a desire for Britain to play a role on the world stage, it's obvious that the best and the strongest platform in the future is going to be a European platform, because the special relationship which Britain has relied on so much is now one between Berlin and Washington rather than between London and Washington. So I think the EU, you know, it's a choice between being a European power or not being a power for Britain going forward. And that's one of the questions that I think will come up in the referendum, if there is one in 2017.
Very interesting. And we have Michaela and then Anke commenting.
Yes, just a short comment on this enlargement-related issue. I mean, even though it might be unrealistic for Ukraine to be a member for a long time ahead, we all know that. Still, I think, as you mentioned very much, that enlargement is a pull factor. Membership is a pull factor that is one of the strongest that the EU has, and also incitament for also modernization. So the process and the methodology that we see, where the Eastern Partnership kind of has a light version of it, the more for more principle, it's something still to be aware of very much and to look at, because sometimes the road towards the membership is more important than the membership itself, because it provides you with a modernization path, which is quite incredible. And also, I'd like to mention just also the current enlargement situation, because here it's very important not to forget the unfinished business in the Western Balkans. We tend to do that very much, and see to that right now it's quite calm, but there are a lot of tensions there, and to keep the process rolling, not with the goal of having new members within 5 or 10 years, but at least having the process rolling, also for the same sake that the methodology that we're into the enlargement process provides the best way for modernization, reforming, and then stability. So just to have that still on the EU agenda, I think is very important in all aspects.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right. First of all, the UK needs the EU. Okay, but the UK is one of the 5 permanent United Nations Security Council members and has nuclear weapons. So the UK counts, whatever we may think about the UK getting more engaged with the EU or less engaged. The UK has always pursued a policy within the EU and towards the EU of using it instrumentally, using it when it seems useful, and not using it when other channels seem more appropriate. And that's, of course, for the national governments to decide. The question of Ukraine is, I think this is the wrong discussion about Ukraine now and membership, because the debate is really about 10 years ago, 12 years ago. Was that the point where the EU made the fundamental mistake of not offering the membership perspective to Ukraine, to Moldova, to Georgia, to any other country, of closing the door explicitly with that European neighbourhood policy, everything but membership? Because, of course, there's no doubt about the situation right now, that EU membership is not right now on the cards, but would we have seen, I mean, that's the counterfactuals, that we don't really have an answer to that. Would we have seen a different situation, more stability in Europe, a different type of Ukraine, if that membership perspective had been offered then, in 2003, in 2004, before the 1st of May 2004? The other thing that I wanted to say to Mark's comment, we're talking a lot about EU unity, about the member states, and we're talking a lot about the lack of a strategy. What about the resources, the kind of instruments that are on the table, the mechanisms that are being used, engagement policy and integration policy? Is that perhaps one of the issues that a clearer strategy and the common interests could then address? I think the fundamental issue is the shadow of history that is hanging over Europe, and what very much of what Mark has said, of course, is reflecting the discussions in Europe. That's not your personal views, I know, that's the general situation, and that's the view, but that's the shadow of history is what is really hanging over Europe. And I still remember doing interviews in Brussels with decision makers in EU institutions and from the member states that were just, with my hypothetical, from the research point of view, my hypothetical question, what about using hard power instruments? No, with Russia, never, ever, because you know what then will happen. What Merkel also expressed now in Munich at the security conference. And then but I don't want to talk about that scenario. So that perhaps is one of the fundamental issues, because all we're talking about is sanctions, is trade, it's we have NATO, we have the US, and we don't want a third world war, but what are the options right now? And of course it won't solve the situation in Ukraine, but that is one part of the discussion, not just the strategy and not just unity, also the instruments.
The instruments, exactly. Very important component. Roderick, do you have a comment on this subject as well?
Maybe just a word. I mean, firstly, just to react a bit to Anchor in the UK. Yes, you know, UN Security Council and nuclear weapons, etc. But if the UK isn't doing enough to fill that seat, then we have a serious problem. So it may matter whatever, but if it's not living up to that status, then we're in danger, and that obviously needs some kind of EU engagement. And the second, perhaps, on strategy, and just to pick up on your vivid discussion with Mark, Just to ask a little bit whether strategy is still possible. You know, if we have been living for the last 20 years in a world where the units were global reach plus national sovereignty, then yeah, you can think in sort of classic strategic terms. If we're moving into a sort of German European type order where it's regionalism plus sort of federal decentralization, then we're hitting these really sludgy issues such as geography suddenly matters again, history suddenly matters again, and we can't put together these nice sort of rational means-ends calculations. That's not how life works anymore. So I think we really need
Has life ever worked that way?
No, but we could at least pretend, I think. And that's possibly where the problems come from. But now we sort of have to face up to a different world, and I wonder how strategy then reacts as a sort of activity. So another question mark. My apologies.
Thank you very much. I think it has been time to round up the seminar for today. We will have, there is a lot of current very urgent issues for the EU to deal with within the short term and this spring, but there is also a larger strategic work that will be ongoing, aiming first with a global assessment report in June, and then there are discussions on whether a new strategy work will be pursued during and start off during the later part of 2015. So the Institute will definitely return to these issues, and the scorecard work will continue and have even more challenges perhaps for next year, and we will really look forward to the results already now. So welcome back also to the ECFR.
Thank you very much.
Thank you much for coming today.